and without the benefit of a jury, instead seeing the proceedings run by someone who, metaphorically speaking, could be considered a hanging judge, out to hang you up, out to somehow deter your lawful endeavors because of their own prejudices. So how then do we return to the original intent of our founders? As your next United States Senator, I will introduce on the Senate side the Congressional Responsibility Act. Very simple act. What it would entail once it becomes law is this. Every proposed regulation, you see right now, the regulators dream up new policies, they promulgate new regulations, and then there's a little period of time for public comment. And then they are published in the Federal Register where they carry the full force of law. What the Congressional Responsibility Act would mandate is that every proposed regulation would be sent to the House and the Senate for an up or down vote, and that way you can hold constitutional officers accountable, and that way we can return to the original intent of Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution. So I will introduce I will also introduce, and let me pause here because, again, knowing there are watchful eyes, I dare not engage in any political plagiarism like our Vice President, Joe Biden. You know, Joe has many faults, but chief among them, his willingness to borrow a turn of phrase or perhaps lift a speech entirely and claim it as his own. Now, I may have run for public office before, I may have even served, but in this instance, I shan't take on those unfortunate, I wouldn't call them qualities or those traits. Let me fully give credit to my old congressional colleague, John Shadegg, who's retiring from the 3rd District after a job well done. On the House side, I would introduce the Congressional Responsibility Act, and John would introduce another measure that some interpreted as a companion piece of legislation. He called it the Enumerated Powers Act. I think there's a more accurate title, and when I introduce this in the Senate, I will do so renaming it the Constitutional Citation Act. And this is all it would require. For every piece of legislation introduced in either the House or the Senate, the sponsors of that bill, in the opening lines of the bill, will cite the specific provision that gives the Congress the right to legislate on that matter in the first place. And in that way, we help to restore the integrity of our constitutional system and the original intent of our founders. So I will likewise introduce the Constitutional Citation Act. Now, and again, especially for those, not really prying eyes, but electronic eyes that are here, be prepared as we transition, still utilizing the Constitution, still dealing with a legislative agenda as your next senator, but yes, we do move into the realm of comparison and contrast. Article 4, Section 4 of our Constitution reads as follows. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. Let me pause there just for a little explanation. I know we're at a great Republican gathering. This citation was offered long before the birth of our Republican Party. It is not meant to be partisan. Again, we turn to Dr. Franklin for wonderful definition analogies. Dr. Franklin put it this way. Dr. Franklin defined a democracy as 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. But he defined a republic as a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. And that really is the essence of our small r Republican system. The majority usually carries the day, and yet there are safeguards built in so that the political minority likewise can be heard and represented. At any rate, let me return to the full text of Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each against invasion. The admonition is clear and unmistakable. It is the role of our federal government to enforce immigration law, to ensure the sanctity and sovereignty and security of our borders. And it is an effort and an area in which the federal government has failed miserably. Because 5 years ago, serving in the United States House, I introduced the Enforcement First Act. In many ways, Senate Bill 1070 is modeled on what I was trying to do nationally. Now, assuredly, my Enforcement First Act went much further. Beyond the simple requirement of enforcement of existing immigration law, my legislation likewise called for security infrastructure, i.e. a fence, etc., on our borders, and yes, the introduction of our standing military on our border to supplement the efforts of our Border Patrol. And one other key provision, that we return to the original intent of our 14th Amendment, to end any confusion about the doctrine that has come to be employed, courtesy of the courts, on so-called birthright citizenship that has resulted not only in millions coming northward from our neighbor to the south, but also this modern-day phenomenon of people around the world in this jet age timing the gestational period to come to our nation for the blessed event. There's a whole term for that group of folks, birth tourists. And yet the Constitution is clear. Or, I beg your pardon, the amendment to the Constitution. It was offered by Senator Jacob Howard in the wake of the Civil War and President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The 14th Amendment was written to give the full fruits of citizenship to those who had been freed from the bondage of involuntary servitude. Indeed, as we look back across the panorama of history, our party was founded on the genuine notion that all men are created equal and that slavery was a scourge that had to be abolished. Section 1 of our 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. In the speech introducing the 14th Amendment on the floor of the United States Senate, Senator Jacob Howard made it crystal clear in his remarks that the key phrase in Section 1 was the clause, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. He pointedly referred to those who might be in this country, aliens, members of another nation's diplomatic corps, who were subject to the jurisdiction of their home nation. And therefore, any children born to them would not be citizens of the United States. Now understand that Section 5 says this: the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So Section 5 tells us that we can, in common statute, not with a new constitutional amendment, but through standard statute, we can return to the original intent of the 14th Amendment. And there is language in the Enforcement First Act to do so. Now, a moment ago I mentioned the contrast could not be clearer. And it is simply this. 5 years ago, I was introducing the Enforcement First Act while my opponent was teaming with Ted Kennedy to write a bill that had been given a wonderfully poll-tested name: Comprehensive immigration